So our whole approach to human excellence, and in fact the problem of maturation, really makes the central motif, the core variable, the issue of the intent to give or serve. I mean, we're saying that maturation is a journey from birth to death, and at birth you've had nothing yet, so whatever you're going to get, you'll still get unconditionally. When you die, you either lose or give everything unconditionally. So,
Right.
and you know, the successful experience is not that it gets taken from you, is that you give. So it suggests that succeeding at maturing means a move from being unconditionally had to get to being unconditionally had to give. And that then cascades also into how one deals with others, and the sort of the world that you experience, how benign you experience the world, and how successful your life can eventually be deemed to be. But the problem with this, with framing giving, or that success rather being rooted in the intent to give, is that people sometimes think that is always about being nice, and that's not necessarily so. I mean, yes, if a hungry child asks you for food, then giving would mean to give the child food. But if a strong man is walking through a park and he sees a little old lady being beaten by a thug for her handbag, then what the strong man should do is beat up the thug. So giving isn't always about being nice. It's about being appropriate. It's about acting on the requirements of the situation that you're in. And those requirements are kind of in two categories. It's either like when you're giving food to the child, it's about being generous. And when you're confronting the thug, it is about being courageous.
Right. So could one say then that when people think of the being nice, they are thinking of generosity only?
I think that is the problem, that they don't realize that giving has this confrontational requirement too.
And being generous when that is not called for?
Well, then that's about taking. So I mean, it stands to reason that the opposite to generosity would be selfishness, and the opposite to courage would be cowardice. And in a sense, what we're saying is that that taking is, in a sense, getting your logic wrong, to act in a situation that requires courage in a so-called generous way, and vice versa. So if the child asks you for food and you slap the child, and we said, you know, why are you hitting the child? And you say, no, I'm being courageous. You know, that's not courage. That's just you being selfish. Whereas if the strong man is walking through the park, the little old lady is being beaten by the thug, and he runs over, he grabs the woman's bag and he gives it to the thug, then he's not being generous. He's being cowardly.
Right.
So basically, giving means being appropriate. It means giving each situation its due. And that due might be kind, it might be sweet, or it might be a confrontation. And what's very important is it's all concerned with how you act. It's about what you do. And, you know, either courage or generosity that aren't based in action is, in a sense, nonsense. I mean, you act courageously, you act generously.
One could even say maybe that it isn't generosity or courage until
unless you've acted. I
think
that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. What isn't apparent to people, though, is that there's behind this ability to be appropriate, to give the situation its due, there's a whole other skill, and that skill is called seeing things as they are. I mean, if you reflect on your own life and situations where you, in hindsight, had not acted appropriately, and if you say, well, why did that happen? More often than not, you'd say, well, I misappraised the situation. I didn't see it as it was, and that's why I behaved inappropriately. So sitting behind giving each situation its due is another skill. It's called seeing things as they are. And what's important about seeing things as they are is that there's necessarily two corresponding, therefore, inward qualities to generosity and courage. If we say giving each situation its due is about being courageous and generous, then what would be the inward kind of the sort of the inward component of generosity, and what would be the inward component of courage? The inward component of generosity is gratitude.
Right.
Because you know, when I'm being generous, I'm by definition giving to give away. If I'm giving something in the spirit of making an investment, so I can call upon you tomorrow to give back to me, then you can't really call what I've done as generous. So generous is giving in order to give away.
So if I help you with something thinking that you will then help me. That is not
That's
generosity.
not generous. That's making an investment. So,
Right.
yeah. Now the question is, what enables one to give away? Well, it's that you know that you've received in excess of your due. When I'm grateful, I know I've received in excess of my due. If I don't think I've received my due, then I'm still owed. Then I'm not grateful, then I'm resentful.
And then you can't be generous.
And then I can't be generous because I'm owed. So my gratitude enables my generosity. And similarly, what sits behind courage is the issue of trust. Because if I trust you, if I don't trust you, then how can I find out that I can trust you? Well, I've got to take a risk. I've got to do a courageous thing. Having done that courageous thing, I earn a little bit of trust, which enables me to be more courageous with you a second time. So what you also see then is these things have almost like a compounding effect. But the key issue we're trying to get across here is that you can't act right if you don't see right.
Yes.
That sitting behind appropriate action is appropriate appraisal, appropriate reflection. And we call that span of getting the inside and the outside right, we call that transactional correctness. In other words, transactional correctness isn't just about being courageous and generous. Because there's a hidden component to that isn't immediately apparent, which is really about gratitude and trust. So if you want to crack the code of getting it right, then you've actually not just got to change what you do, you've got to change how you see.
Because the action in itself doesn't say if it is
exactly
appropriate or not.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And also, if you have to understand that how you see is kind of made up by judgments on an ongoing basis. I mean, fundamentally, there's only two ways of seeing the world. There's either way of seeing the world, which is rooted in gratitude. And when you look at the world basically rooted in gratitude, you're saying, I have in the past received in excess of my due, then it becomes easy for me to be generous, to give away. But because I recognize that I've received in excess of my due, I therefore trust the world, trust the future, and it's easy for me to do courageous things. So it is how I describe the world to myself. My ongoing narrative of the world creates an inner register that then produces a filter. That then it's how I describe the world. Kind of then is actually what my intent is rooted in.
And the root is then gratitude, because gratitude, enables both the generosity and the trust.
Exactly right. So when one talks intent, it's so easy to think of intent about action. I'm doing this to get there. And what we're arguing here is that the issue of your intent is actually rooted not in what you do, but in how you see.
Right.
In your perception of the world. Because how you describe the world to yourself behind your eyes is like an internal commentary about the world on an ongoing basis. And that internal commentary eventually has a register to it, like a feel that, in a sense, tinges the window that you're looking through when you're looking out at the world. And if it's healthy, it has an affirming tinge. It's maybe say a green tinge to it. And it suggests that when you get things wrong, in other words, when you root your view of the world in resentment, it means that you will then look out at the world through a negating lens. You'd see it kind of almost like a red tinge to your world. You won't trust it. In fact, when you act, you will act expediently. You will act in pursuit of your self-interest. You will therefore do cowardly and selfish things.
Because you so to say, know that you can't trust the world.
That's exactly right.
Right. So regardless of how you see it, if you have the green or the red lens, you will prove yourself to be right.
Exactly right. Yeah. And I mean, the thing is that the world then, I mean, if you act in a selfish way, then you start getting, the people start to respond to you reciprocally. So you then get all the material to demonstrate that you can't trust the world.
Yeah.
So you kind of produce the world that you convince yourself of is there in your internal dialogue. And so clearly the trick is to learn how to intervene in internal dialogue, in how to intervene in the narrative that we carry on the world on the inside.
Because what you're saying is really that we cannot change the outer world if we don't change the inner world.
Exactly. Exactly. That in fact the inner world produces the outer world.
Right.
Yeah. So the question is, how does one then affect that transformation if you were looking at the world through a red lens? How do you change your narrative? And the thing is, it's very difficult to change something you're sitting in. We have this example of working on a car. You can't work on the car while you're driving it.
No, preferably not.
You've got to get out of the car.
Right.
So so that process of getting out is, in a sense, operating from a place which is deeper than your internal dialogue.
That's getting out of
your internal dialogue.
Yes.
So in a sense, there's two problems here. The one is to change your intent. Your intent is actually changing, working on your description of the world. But working on your description of the world is really is enabled the deeper you operate within yourself, the more inwardly gathered you are. It's very difficult to work on the thoughts you're sitting in. So in a sense, what meditators experience is that they start to operate from a place which is deeper than their thoughts. They describe their thoughts as clouds that come sort of in the sky that drift through. So they're no longer that identified with their thought. In a sense, they're operating at a deeper place, and we call that deeper place a place of being inwardly gathered.
And when the thoughts are like clouds, you can see them clearly.
You can see them clearly, yeah. And you can then also challenge them and interrogate them better. So let's then examine what this thing of inward gatheredness is all about. So at the limit of your peripheral vision, there's something that we would call there's a boundary, which is like a window frame, and we call that window frame your window of perception.
Right.
And in a sense, you're looking through this window of perception. This window of perception is the dividing line between two worlds, two very different realms. There's it's first of all the difference between the outward, the world out there, the world that you act in, and the world that you perceive, and then there's you, the perceiver, on this side of the window of perception. This is also consistent with the distinction between the place where you act and what you see, the place of reflection, the place of witnessing, if you like. And it's also consistent with the distinction between the other and the self, in terms of how we normally experience things. So the window of perception is kind of like the dividing line between subject and object, seer, seen, inward, outward. Basically, when your intent is to get, if you want something from somebody else, that person's ability to withhold what you want gives them power over you. And you're kind of hooked like a fish. You're sort of trying to reach out into the world to get what you want, but the problem is that they've got control over the thing that you want. So if you want something from somebody else, you're outwardly gathered, your attention gets pulled out, almost you're trying to reach through the window of perception, and you are, in a sense, alienated from this depth that exists behind your eyes, behind the window of perception. Now, if you manage to crack the code and sincerely shift your intent in a situation from taking to giving, then the first instance, the person that you're dealing with loses their control over you. If I want something from you, your ability to withhold what I want gives you power over me. So if I don't want it, you lose that power. In other words, I get unhooked. And I become outwardly separate. The world no longer dominates me, and I become inwardly gathered. And that produces an experience of being unassailable, of being invulnerable, of being, I suppose the Buddhists would call it detached, but not in a negating way. It's like a sense of freed from my victimhood to the world.
Off the hook.
Quite literally off the hook. So clearly what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop a sense of inner depth. We're trying to become increasingly inwardly gathered. And the key point about that is that you can never be finally entirely inwardly gathered, because if you just feel what it feels like behind your eyes, the depth of this experience that your looking comes out of, or your perception comes out of behind your eyes, there's really no back to that. So it is infinitely deep. But we don't operate from that infinite depth. We operate from a very kind of narrow place right at the top, sort of, and we're sort of pushed up against the window of perception by our needs and our descriptions of the world, which keep us needy for outcomes, trying to manage outcomes, get things that we want. And what's very important about this narrative that carries on the inside is that it's layered. So there's bits of your intent which you can interrogate quite easily, because they're rooted in things that are very conscious. So, right now I'm hungry, I want to eat, or whatever. I mean, there's very conscious, is right at the top of my attention. But there's bits of my intent that are rooted in conditioning that happened very long ago. So, and so within me, my internal dialogue is stacked in layers. And the bits of internal dialogue that really define the world that I experience are normally rooted in trauma. So what is it that makes me decide that, I cannot trust the world? It's because things have happened to me in the past that have given me the conviction that the world is dangerous in that area or that particular thing. So we carry out the narrative that produces a cynical view of life. We carry that narrative in layers. The most explicit is kind of loudly articulated, but it gets more and more subtle. It's almost like whispered in our being. And what happens when you become increasingly inwardly gathered is that it is like literally getting out of the car. So you're not sitting in the car that you're trying to work on. You're getting out of the car, so the thing now becomes an object to you. You can see it clearly, and because you can see it clearly, you can resolve it. And when you resolve it, you actually not only deepen your experience of your inner space, but you also surface older, deeper stuff that then also gets, in a sense, cathartic and worked through on an ongoing basis. As you clarify things, as you get increasingly inwardly gathered, you create a deeper bucket. You and I had this conversation before, that your consciousness is like a bucket, but the problem is that bucket is so full for most people, they're stuck right at the window of perception. They've got very little maneuverability. But the deeper you operate, the more stuff you clarify, the deeper you operate within that bucket, the more maneuverability you have, and the less assailable you are, the more invulnerable you are, if you like.
So in this example here, we have a snake, for example, and a cat. So something quite horrible has happened with a snake sometime long ago.
That's right.
Would that then relate to snakes, or could that make me think that the world in general is a dangerous place?
Well, both.
Both, yeah.
Yeah. So, but it then has that particular form of the snake.
Right.
So the reason why I chose these graphics is that human beings' fear of snakes is really primordial. I mean, I think it's ancestral because we were initially kind of tree-dwelling beings. So all cultures have a horror of snakes.
So it might not even be my personal horror.
Exactly. We learn our horrors. We get taught our horrors by our and they very early, in our earliest kind of years, we get told, be careful, don't. And then we that don't says the world is dangerous in that way.
I see.
Another way of looking at this then is really what changes as we get deeper is that the boundaries between self and other, and my experience of the boundary between myself and the self and the other gets more and more, gets thinner and thinner. So I think it's true to say that your conditional motive, what you're trying to get from the world, is then based on your conditioning. This is the line of sight of the text that we should develop so far. So your conditional motive is rooted in your conditioning. And your conditioning is rooted in experiences that you had in the past. And what's very important about those experiences is that they actually tell you who you think you are. Because every judgment you make that's rooted on a trauma is saying that you're negating something, saying that is not me. You know, I mean, even if you're trying to be really affirmative about your life, if I met you on a plane and you were to describe, you know, you would say, you know, who are you? You know, well, I'm Anna, and, you know, I've got 2 kids, and you sort of describe the life I'm, you know, everything that you're saying, you're actually saying more about what you're not than about what you are. You know, so if you say you've got 2 kids, it means you don't have 4. If you say you kind of
if you say I'm Swedish, it means I'm not anything else.
Mongolian.
Yeah. Okay.
So every comment we make about ourselves is, first of all, rooted in biography, something you learned about yourself, and secondly, is a statement of negation. You're saying more about what you're not. Everything you claim to be excludes a universe. So these, and it's these things, my conviction about who I am, that those convictions are layered. And some of them are really deep, you know. And each one of them is a statement of negation. Each one of them is a further limiting of your idea, your experience of who you are, you know. And the ones that have the most sort of overwhelming effect are the ones that come from your guts. They're visceral. They're the ones that give you know, where your disgust and your horror comes from, because that's really saying that really isn't me. So those things are the ones that are normally been rooted in something that was really unpleasant when that conviction about who you were got made. So what happens as you grow, as you know, we spoke about this inward gatheredness, then producing this deepening of the self, creating a deeper and deeper consciousness. You know, you're not stuck up against the window of perception by the volume of the noise on the inside. There's more space. But then what also becomes apparent is you can see that the boundary between self and the world becomes less and less distinct. It becomes thinner because there's fewer lines of text that are running that are trying to convince you just how separate and different you are.
Yes.
So every time you resolve a crisis, every time you take an incremental step in deepening your internal dialogue and you quieten your internal dialogue, the effect of that is that there's a greater experience not of separateness and discontinuity between the self and the world, but a greater experience of connectedness and continuity between the self and the world. You know, and just as an aside, it is exactly that understanding of my connectedness, the connectedness between the self and the world, that gets galvanized when I act in the best interest of the other. When I act in my own interest, what I'm really saying is that the interest of the other and the interest of the self are discontinuous.
Right.
Right. Yeah. When I act in the interest of the other, what I'm telling myself deeply is actually to act in your interest is acting in my interest. The interest of the other and the self are continuous. In other words, I don't experience me and mine as separate from you and yours. I experience me and mine as connected with you and yours. That sense of connection, the old people used to call that love. Connectedness, oneness with. You know, so the deeper you are in terms of how you operate in your own self, the less layers there are to your internal dialogue, the less of a sense of crisp difference there is between you and the world, the more you have an experience of love with the world. Of, you know, it's almost like it's like you're swimming in a matrix of something warm and affirming. You're not standing crisp and cold on your own, so naked in the snow. You know,
and there's no reason to compete then.
There's no reason to compete, because why compete with a very big thing, which is you and I?
Yeah. So I was just curious about the examples we had about, for example, you know, the having 2 kids and being Swedish. So those are facts.
Well,
or?
That's true, they are facts, but is that who you are?
I see.
Who were you? Who was this bright, scintillating spark of magic and attention that came into the world before it got called Anna, before it started to develop a story and a narrative about itself?
Okay, I see.
You know, so
it is limiting to sort of
exactly.
call on those, so to say, facts.
And I mean, the key thing about every aspect of biography, the issue is not to challenge the fact that it's true, because it is. But to say, but listen, I am whatever I might say about myself, I'm infinitely more than my description.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So each one of these lines of text that you've got running in your being, which describes who you think you are, it's like another bar on a cage. And eventually there's so many bars that you can hardly see any light of the world out there, because you're completely stuck in this cage of your presumption and conditional motive and conditioning. So as you start operating deeper and deeper, more and more of these bars come off. And you then start to experience more of the world as it is. Your experience of the world is not that it's this distinct from you, it's more permeable. There's more of the outside comes in and more of the inside can go out, actually. It's like a reciprocal, permeable thing. And eventually, once all the bars come off, you reintroduce to the being that got stuck into the cage in the first place. So this is then, the implication to this is, when you want something from the world, you become outwardly gathered. It's like you're trying to reach into the world, reach into the outward to get what you want. And the problem when you do that is you become a person among people and you become a thing among things. You contend. The problem with two things in the world is that they can't occupy the same space. So if I'm trying to appear, trying to stand out and get from the world what I want, then by definition I start to contend for space with the people around me. So my whole experience of the world becomes contentious. I start having an adversarial relationship with the life that I have and with the people around me. So this is the challenge of being outwardly gathered. The more you try and appear, the more significant you try and become, the more you try and stand out in the world, become a person among people, the more adversarial your life will become, the more you'll end up fighting. So the trick is to shift your intent and to stop so that you can become more inwardly gathered. And you can do this to an extremity where, in fact, you no longer even have an illusion that you're a person among people. Because on this side of the window of perception, the thing that's looking through the window of perception doesn't have arms and legs. The looker, my arms and legs are objects to me. They're not me. Who's the thing that's looking behind the arms and legs? So the more inwardly gathered you become, the more you start experiencing yourself no longer as a person among people. You're no longer contending for space. In fact, you're making space. And that making space then creates eventually the position where you get so completely inwardly gathered that you experience that everything that you perceive is kind of in a bubble, and the perceiver wraps around the bubble that you're looking into.
Wow.
In other words, we start off thinking, our experience of things is that we think that we're a person among people, and that I'm this small thing, and that I have this big universe around me. So the looker is the microcosm, the inward is the micro, and the outward is the macrocosm. But what happens actually when you start to become inwardly gathered is that the exact opposite becomes true for you. It's not the looker, the inward, isn't the small thing encapsulated by the world. The world is encapsulated by the looker. So in other words, the thing that is looking through you, through the lens that you're looking at the world out of, that thing is actually the macrocosm. It's not the microcosm.